Ladies and gentlemen, today is a wonderful day. I get to speak to the one and only Mr. Satori again on his book, Tense Before Temples, Rough Drafts on Building a Culture That Lasts. I highly suggest this book. You need to go pick it up. And we've made it. We've had two conversations, and I've really enjoyed. I mentioned last time how this is exactly the book you want to give to, I think, teenagers, people in general, people who are interested in these topics. But it's a tremendous, each one of these sections is a profound conversation starter, which I think actually, as a larger claim, works like this, I think more and more are going to be important, if I just speak as a Christian, for the church to do. I think we've had a time where the church has been very focused on sermons and teaching. And I think that's very important. And obviously, I have a bias, and we're saying this with Estuary and the TLC, obviously, are spaces of conversation, spaces where people can actually orbit a topic and try to think it through and develop it. And I think books like this that afford those kind of spaces of discussion and conversation will actually become more and more important. And so a text like this that has the different sections that can kind of facilitate a space, I think is extremely, extremely important. And so, again, I just think we're in an age where the church needs spaces of discussion and conversation, and we're moving into that kind of way of thinking. I know Luke has talked about a kind of return to the oral tradition, and the church has done a lot of sermons, a lot of teaching, but a way to facilitate discussion where people can bring in all of the complexity and individuation and particularity they're going through in their life and to discuss it and to work it through. And if we don't do that, I think character development, I think equipping people for what they need to deal with the world today will become harder and harder. So a book like this is perfect for that. But we've made it to chapter 7, Mr. Satori, and that's called Exodus. And I'm curious, and we will now return to the most pivotal story of the Bible and the history of the Jewish people, the Exodus from Egypt. Wow, most pivotal story in the Bible. That's a big one, and yet I think there's a lot to that. You will also talk about static cultures, wilderness, prophecy, all of these topics, and each one of these, indeed, could be the basis of a space by which a community could come together and orbit like a campfire. And I think that's very, very important. But Mr. Satori, Exodus, static culture, vanishing third places. I'd be curious your thoughts on that, or et cetera, so forth, or what you've been thinking in general. And again, it's Tense Before Temples, everyone, which you can find in the description. So, Mr. Satori, wonderful to have you today, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Well, so I think it's interesting. I was just reflecting on my own life recently and thinking about some, changes or things we've done, and wondering if, I can look back and say, like, we were in an Egypt-like environment for a while, and maybe now we've been in a wilderness, and hopefully are moving towards a promised land, as for me and my family, in the direction that we've taken vocationally and in our involvement with the church and things like that. And yeah. so and that also, that's a similar kind of pattern to the creation, fall, redemption kind of narrative that's very commonly found throughout Scripture. And I think that's important. It's important to have all those things because, like, there's something that's afforded by Egypt, all the structure, and that's what I say, like, where even, look at the way that we are right now, like all of the things that modernity has produced, the technological advancements have afforded so much. They've eliminated so many, like, really perennial problems, things like starvation and infant mortality, and so much reduced compared to, like, what our ancestors had to deal with. And that has allowed for a really, a period of unprecedented growth, population wise, of course, like we've seen that in the 20th century and since. But, that's kind of this problem of the wheat and the tares. And Jesus says, don't try to separate them while they're growing, so with growth, comes good and bad, and it's hard to recognize the difference. It's hard to have the knowledge of good and evil while you're really still standing in the garden, I guess you could say. But once you get out into the wilderness, then you can look back, you can kind of discern what was good about what happened in there and what was bad. And then that's how you can kind of build your your movement forward for when you enter your next phase of opportunity or whatever. And I think I think this is an observable pattern in the Bible and in culture and history beyond it, of like civilizations come, they hit a end point, one of these Nash equilibria, a game theory collapse of some sort, and then some people survive out of that, and they carry with them some remnants of that thing. And so, I was going to say, as far as the Bible goes, well, that's where you have like this literate group come on into the wilderness, on get Mount Sinai, the written law, the alphabetic language, which really is like the unique inheritance of the Hebrew people. And they bring that out of the hieroglyphic empire they leave, and then that's been in a part of every subsequent civilization that's come since. And then there's many more things that have come and gone and carried over. So so I think it's good to look at those patterns, just even obviously in the macro scale, it helps you like see like, well, what seems like the end is not always the end. God's always preserving a remnant. There's always hope. Maybe we're on the last leg of some particular epoch, but I don't think it's the end of humanity. I don't think we have a real complete, existential crisis, as far as extinction goes. I don't think that we're there, but we will have to figure out what is good about what's going on now, and maybe even just in this is the kind of the thing of suspending judgment while you're in this kind of a time period. If you find yourself in Egypt, just try to preserve as much knowledge as you can, as much understanding, because you can take those things, they become like tools. And this is kind of, I think, the section of the book, it is the tools section. And then you can decide like which of those things do you keep and discard, or what's best to use in your next environment. But so yeah, maybe if you find yourself in a period of abundance, or things are going well, but you know that there's always the potential for threat. This is kind of like what you talk about, like when you're investing or whatever, you don't want to put everything into just the stock market or whatever, or then you're banking on everything going as it's been going, which nothing goes forever. So put some in that, see how long it goes, and then diversify your portfolio and try to become a well-rounded person, and that'll help carry you through a lot better when you get into the wilderness. So
I think that's wonderful. I these topics bring to mind the concept of return that I'm always very interested in. It comes up in Hegel, it comes up in Hume, and also this idea in Deleuze that the only way to get creativity is repetition. Like if you don't, like, repeating always has an excess, and he's taking this kind of inspired by Hume. When something repeats, it's never exactly the same, even if it seems the same, right? There's always a kind of creativity. And so what's very interesting about this is that a return has a creative potential, is what all of them are saying. Now, by return, that doesn't necessarily mean return to where you grew up and lived there or something like that, but a certain ontological return, like a return to, so let's say you start in a stagnant state. They would say you need that if you leave and return to a stagnant state or rooted state, that it's not the same. In fact, they would you could say that if you just kind of stay in the city and you never go out into the wilderness to return to a city, then you can't really have, you could even say things like you can't have certain qualities of relationship, only conformity. You can't have discernment, only procedure and stuff you've absorbed from the zeitgeist. So there's this interesting idea that there's this thrust in thinking that suggests that there is something about returning that is precisely the quality of experience or the quality of an environment that is required for the human to be fully developed. Now, the problem is, first off, we don't want to leave because it's scary. So we don't want to go on the exodus. We don't want to go on the journey. And that creates all sorts of pathologies. The belonging, again, part one, we'll talk about the banality of evil. We'll talk about the inability to handle otherness and pluralism because you're just kind of staying where you go. But then, of course, there's the leaving and then thinking you're better than those old backward people who never left their hometown, or you leave and then you're scared to settle because you're scared to submit, to commit, right? So then you get that going on, right? Or you go into the wilderness, and I think this points to Exodus, and you don't want to have your journey organized by any kind of authority. You just want to determine it on your own terms, right? And that's when you get kind of chaos, right? And what's very interesting, like the thinker that I always kind of turn to on that topic is indeed David Hume. And I really think his project has been dramatically overlooked in favor of a silly empiricism. He's a defender of common life, and his major concern is the idea that the greatest problem of philosophy is philosophy. Like, philosophy is very dangerous. But then if you don't have philosophy, you're defenseless to people that try to manipulate you. And furthermore, philosophy is needed so that you actually have roots versus mere conformity, so that you have relationship versus a mere kind of mass or mob in kind of those totalitarian languages and things like that. And so for David Hume, we all start off in a common life. You're born in a home, right? And what ends up happening is he wants to describe kind of the philosophical journey. And the philosophical journey is, you say, you're born on your hometown, and one day you start going, why do we live this way? And, why this way? And what ends up happening is now there's what he calls the philosophical ascent, where you kind of, and David Livingston and Norm Kim Smith are really good on this. You start to rise above, right? Because you realize it could be different. It could have been different. Well, if it could have been different and it's not given, that kind of pulls you out of it a little bit because you feel the contingency. It's no longer as absolute. And so you begin a kind of philosophical ascent. Now, here's the problem. As you ascend, because you start going down the philosophical path, and you start also going down, you could say, the theological path, right? Because people talk about this all the time. Theology just kind of separates you from the lived experience of being a Christian. So you begin to ascend. As you ascend, he warns about philosophical melancholia, where you begin to feel alone, detached, you can't connect with anyone, nobody understands your ideas, so a kind of melancholia sets in. And he talks about this notably at the beginning of the Treatise of Human Nature, and I think that's quite an important book. But anyway, this melancholia sets in, which I think is absolutely meaning crisis stuff, like that he's talking about, that it kind of sets in a melancholia, kind of activates. Now, what happens is, as you're ascending, you go to the quote-unquote ivory tower, the place to learn philosophy, to explore abstract thought, and so on and so forth. And that melancholia can actually then, in the place of the ivory tower, lead to philosophical resentment. You resent those people who brainwash you. You resent those people who don't study philosophy. You resent those people who don't have complicated thoughts, right? And then, in fact, because you're so enlightened, you start to believe that gives you legitimacy and authority to tell people how to live, right? And you start kind of going back and saying how they ought to live. And this becomes philosophical tyranny, right? David Hume's warning is, first, that the history of philosophy is full of this move, of philosophy basically ascending out of a common life to a place of tyranny, melancholia, and destruction, right? And it becomes a very bad thing. This is also basically autonomous rationality because it's no longer embedded in anything. He calls this bad philosophy. And he believes basically there's a bad theology, or a false theology. There's a bad economics. There's a bad sociology. There's all bad forms of these things. And it becomes a kind of self-relating thought that puts itself in a position of judgment over any embedded way of life or any common life, right? So you could hear that and say, oh, so David Hume is saying we just shouldn't do philosophy. We should just stay in our common life and never, ask these big questions. And he said, nope, can't do that. Because the problem is, if you do that, and he's a historian, some king over there is going to show up one day and say, in the name of justice, you have to give me all your property. In the name of God, you have to fight in a war for me. In the name of some philosophical principle, you have to change your life. And his point is that if you don't have philosophy, you're not going to be able to defend yourself from the person who comes, the snake oil salesman or someone like that. right? And so then you're defenseless and your life gets taken from you, right? So you need philosophy of self-defense. But then if you get that self-defense, you now have begun the ascent, right? You've begun pulling yourself out of common life. So the name of the game, therefore, is the return to common life. So you go on the philosophical journey, you kind of see the fact that it could have been different. You go through the big ideas and then you commit to a church. Then you embed yourself in a common life. You return to something stable. You commit to something. Now, the return to common life does not necessarily, again, mean you go back to the town you grew up with. It could mean that, but it means you go back to committing to someone and not seeing yourself as superior to other people because you have like philosophical understanding. In fact, what you do in common life is you use your philosophy to defend common life, to defend the community. You almost take a kind of occupation, actually, and to help people sense make and things like that. Now, much more can be said about this, but the next part of this I want to say is that basically following Peter Berger and all the sociologists, we're all philosophers now because givens have collapsed. We're existentialists, as they say, because we're in a complex world. You're dealing with technology. Everything's interconnected. You're encountering otherness and pluralism and so on and so forth, which creates a feeling of contingency. And in feeling that contingency, you therefore feel, I don't know what to believe, and you're overwhelmed by anxiety. Anxiety, which defines the modern world, which goes with melancholia and the meaning crisis, are precisely philosophical emotions. They're kind of, quote unquote, for David Hume, they're kind of philosophical emotions. And once you feel that, that means you've been pulled out of common life. So it's no longer an option to go back, right? Like it's no longer an option to stay. You've been pulled out unless you're really isolated, like you're not using the internet and you're not interconnected in things. So now basically we have to figure out how to return. We have to figure out, like we're kind of in a certain sort of political and social wilderness. That is defined by, well, mental illness, and Philip Reeve talked about and all of that. And now the question is how indeed you return, right? What does exactly it look like to return? Without simply repressing your knowledge of otherness, repressing complexity, because you can do that. You say, well, I'll return simply to forget everything or ignoring ideas or ignoring philosophy. No, 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 no. If you do that, you're not going to have self-defense. And then when you encounter someone who thinks different than you, you're not going to be able to handle it. It's going to overwhelm you, right? So you have to go through the development of thought. You have to do this, but it runs the risk of philosophical melancholia and then philosophical tyranny and self-righteousness and, you know, the dialectics of enlightenment that Adorno and Horkheimer, they basically said that totalitarianism needed the Enlightenment because that created, you know, an autonomous rationality that could justify whatever it wanted to do, including destroy the world. So, you know, you got to stop that. So, but you have to play with fire now, basically. Like you have to play with philosophy that runs the risk of totalitarianism, because if you don't, you're not going to be able to self-defend yourself from the tyrant, nor will you be able to actually return to common life, because you actually now have to go through philosophy to find, say, personal knowledge, or to know how to engage in Michel Planier, as Luke will talk about, or people like that, to actually know how to think difference, how to think your community. You have to go through that work, or you can't embed. I'll throw it back to you, but I bring all of that up because when you talk about the topics of exodus, static culture, like all of these different topics in this area, for me, it very strongly overlaps with a lot of this common life, return to common life that David Hume is talking about, the return in Hegel, because in Hegel, you, in a sense, never return. Like if you come back to the same place, it's not the same place. So it's always different. Right. And so in that sense, if you don't ever become conscious of the necessity of something like exodus in your life, you're kind of denying the fact that you're changing. You're kind of denying the fact that that you don't ever return to the same thing. It's like Heraclitus. You never put your foot in the same river twice kind of idea. Right. If you're not able to accept that, then when you inevitably encounter change, or your kids are changing, or you're changing, or your spouse is changing, you're not going to know what to do with that. I mean, another reason why you need philosophy is to be able to handle change, or to handle the fact that people aren't what you thought they were, and not taking it personally and actually seeing it as creative possibility. So there is something for me about the arc that is being described with Exodus, wilderness. This defines all of our lives now, whether we realize it or not, in global pluralism. Mm-hmm. And to the degree we own it and realize that is to the degree I think we can work with that reality artfully. But there's something about looking at these sections that you're describing in the Bible that I think are necessary for our moment. But I'll throw it back to you on any thoughts on anything.
Yeah. So thinking about that journey, you know, and this is something, this is probably easier to articulate now after I've come up with kind of those ideas about the, using AI mediation for the social coordination mechanism, because there's like two different axes. There's the one is the horizontal axis between pluralities of cultures, philosophies. I mean, philosophy is an embedded part within the culture. If the culture is, if you're given a culture, it's got an implicit philosophy in there. It may have a philosophy that is consciously aware of philosophical thought,
Exactly.
but even if it doesn't, so that, if it does, that's good, because then that also is going to probably make you more aware of that horizontal axis. So knowing that there are different cultures, but then also there's this vertical axis, which is maybe to say how far or how deep you can explore from within your given culture. And we don't have givens on the total scale, but we have we do have some commonalities, or especially because we share language. And so by using the same language, you're going to encounter maybe the pluralistic horizontal aspects, just encountering different people. But then you'll also find out that some people have more depth, some cultures have more depth, some philosophies have more depth than others. And maybe it's kind of important to figure out balancing your growth, on a what do you call it? An incline degree. So you're growing horizontally and vertically at the same time. So, because you'll have a lot of people who will maybe see the horizontal difference, and then they just will abandon whatever they grew up with, because this is better than that. But they only were ever 2 levels deep in their native culture. And so they just peg it as a shallow thing. And really maybe what they like about this other one is the fact that they've encountered more depth in another place. And so you can kind of mistake things there. So, obviously that's something I kind of just do, is explore. These are not like, this horizontal and vertical axis wasn't in the book, but I was looking at all these different cultures and trying to figure out like what makes them different. What do they have? And some of the some of the aspects make them really easy to walk away, or really easy to stay within them and embrace more pluralism. Others make them much more isolated. And then you do also have that depth, and the depth goes in different ways too. Because I think like the ultimate one that I pull out there is the Piraha with Daniel Everett in his book, Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes. And it's just it's like such an incredible culture, because it's so self-reinforcing in certain ways. And then it has such very steep, particular like aspects of skepticism or critique, that it allows people to be absolutely certain about the things that they are certain about, and to completely disregard anything that falls outside of it, which is like, why it's essentially such a difficult culture to try to evangelize, and of course, if you look at it now, looking at it, Daniel Everett went in there as a modernist and had certain assumptions about culture that didn't hold up, and that, unfortunately it shook his faith, and kind of couldn't really hold on to that anymore. But it wasn't deep enough. It wasn't deep enough to encounter what he encountered there. I don't think that that's necessarily, like I said, it's almost, it is what's going on in their culture is very relevant to the things in the Bible. It just is like not as so much the message of Jesus per se. They weren't there yet. Like, and I think this is actually a really interesting thing, even just look, to examine the Bible in the light of cultures that we have today, that there are still like, that's a culture that's like, I don't know, pre-flood or like right after the flood. Like that's like the equivalent. It's like, it's basically they got some basic tools, the most basic clothes, and their worldview is very simple. It doesn't have all the complexity of written language or they'll use things like electricity, but it's just like they don't have a philosophical thought about it. It's just like a novelty. It's essentially the same way maybe they feel about things like miracles, or and they do have a robust spiritual worldview. So my thought was, he went in there and he tried to translate the Bible and tried to like explain this concept of like, you have sin and you are morally guilty and therefore you need a substitutionary sacrifice to atone for your sins. And this is just all like, straight over their head. And really where they were at was either, I think the two approaches that would have been more successful was one, in the title of the book, "Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes," to say, hey, look, you're in the Garden of Eden and it's become overrun with snakes. That's bad. Start, here's the story that tells you why you should not tolerate those snakes and you should actually try to overcome them, Or the other one was maybe to just go in there, maybe if you're the Pentecostal, and just say, yes, we believe in these spirits that you are seeing and they're demons, and we want to tell you about the more powerful spirit that has destroyed them or destroyed their power, or who maybe they just go down there and pray and speak in tongues and see what happens. Like that's a really bad missionary situation strategy in most cultures, but it might have been the perfect one for that one. So yeah.
No, I think there's a lot there that's very, very important. I think first on what you were just saying with Everett there, I think that gets into the problem that there are many Christians who are nervous about adding to the Bible and afraid of, I should just present the gospel in its pure form and say what it says, and then trust that God will do the rest, right? That he'll do the rest. I think this is a very prevalent notion based on kind of fear and trepidation, and it's one of the reasons why I think it's a huge deal to take Paul as a model. I mean, Vanderclay was just talking about this. When Paul walks into Rome and he says, hey, you see this stone? It's the unknown God. He's strategizing. He's thinking. He's using analogical reasoning. He's discerning, right? If we don't look at Paul as a model of cultural strategy and wit and discernment, and that we're supposed to figure out how to be like that when dealing with otherness, then we end up just seeing Paul as writing dogmas we're supposed to follow, and we lose the method. And the method is actually, but here's the issue. It is a fundamentally philosophical method then, because you have to be able to think other worldviews, think other ideas, find the joint point, figure out how to kind of offer find the girdle point, the point where the map isn't the territory, and you kind of make them acknowledge that and say, well, there's possibilities here that are interesting, right? And you also need that done to you, because it might be that your understanding of Christianity is reduced to the Roman road, which I think has been very problematic, and you don't think beyond that because you've been led to believe thinking beyond that is idolatry and heresy or something like that, right? Well, maybe encountering the other that would could actually help you get out of that. There's always the risk of even turning, if you believe Christianity is the true religion, there's always the risk of nevertheless treating Christianity as an idolatry if you don't do it in the terms that make you like Jesus, confront your fear, move you out of the common religion, Vanderclay says, and things like that, right? And Peter Rollins talks about that, and I think there's a lot of truth to it. So I think it's really, really important to see in Paul a certain model. But again, Paul is discerning. He said we take the epistles, and I know we've spoken about this. People take the epistles as not cultural strategy, like thinking the culture and the live situation and reasoning through it in a way that's true to what Christ unveiled, that's nevertheless true to the Torah that is fulfilled in Christ. This is high level thinking. This is not easy. And you see, the reason why I like to stress Paul in this way is because sometimes I think Christians are tempted to say, oh, we don't need theology. Well, you don't need theology. So again, like if I go back to David Hume is extremely concerned about what I'll call bad religion. What is bad religion? It is a self-relating theology of system building. He thinks this is just as bad as bad philosophy. And bad economics would be making models that aren't ready for the 2008 financial crisis. There's a whole lot of bad intellectualism, self-relating, internally consistent systems, right? But Hume himself is visiting some of these revivals that are happening in Ireland. He's going because he has no problem with the down-to-earth, blacksmith religious guy, right? Like he has no problem with that guy because he's like, oh, well, that's embedded. The thought of religion is bound by the common life. That keeps it from becoming a self-relating system, because he's also seen in history as a historian where people use self-relating theologies to justify war and violence and killing other people, right? So he wants to stop that, but by putting a limit, a binding principle on philosophy, theology, and all abstract reasoning, which is common life. And that's why he seems like an empiricist, because he's always, like, for example, his famous idea that you can't get a law of causation, only constant conjunction, right? If I drop a ball 1,000 times, I don't know that on the 1,000th the ball won't float. So he's very resistant to natural law. Why? Why is he resistant to natural law? Isn't he just being difficult? No, because if there's a natural law, it is possible then for someone from far, far away in some distant land, to believe that they have found the natural law that makes them able to know everything that's going to happen in your life and your small community. And therefore, I have a right to control you because I know how the heavens work. You don't. And therefore, I have authority over you, or I can manipulate you. And by the way, if it doesn't work, it must be your problem, because I believe in natural law. So he's very, very, very concerned about thinking that can create natural law or kind of a divine authority that doesn't have to honor difference or anything. He's very concerned about that. And that's why he's deconstructing. Why is he deconstructing a stable identity? Is that, he's like, there's only kind of constant impressions, right? Why is he doing that? Because he's concerned about people thinking their identity is not constantly in flux and formation in their common life. He wants identity to be something that you can never extract from a lived process. That's always, why is that? Because if you think you don't need a lived process, let me put it this way, if your identity is stable, regardless the environment around you, well, you can just change the environment all you like and it's not going to affect you. You can bring your good ideas or your machines or whatever and change the world and you'll still be you, because there is some sort of sacred transcendent identity and that you have that is not impacted by the world outside of you, right? He's like, no, you are absolutely inseparable from the world around you and the impressions and the community and all of these different things, right? So the problem with David Hume, Hume is often read as a difficult, like trickster. He's just being difficult, right? No, he's trying to defend common life. That's why he starts the treatise of human nature. Like the treatise of human nature is full of case studies of things like constant conjunction or whatever. He's like, look at all these examples where people think they can get a non-contingent truth outside of common life, and actually you can't do it. And the reason is not because, do you think David Hume doesn't think that the ball on the 1,001 time is going to fall to the ground? Do you really think that he doesn't think that? Of course he thinks that. But he wants to put a limit on the creation of natural laws that would justify, well, forms of determinism that benefit power. And hasn't that happened under materialism? Has it not occurred that your lived experience is just anecdote and subjective and doesn't really count? Yeah, that's what Hume's trying to stop. He's trying to stop all of that. And yet the great irony is people freaking use Hume to justify empiricism that feeds right into the objectivism. So the whole Scottish Enlightenment, anyway, there's a lot of problems with how this movement is interpreted. And so the reason I also say all of that is because what David Hume also is trying to balance is the fact that he basically knows that people are going to use bad philosophy and they're coming for you. They're going to come for you and they're going to try to change your life. And so then he's like, well, then you need philosophy, because you said it very well. Depth allows the wind to blow and you not get pulled away, right? Like if you don't have depth, then you can easily be steamrolled, right? But of course, there's a problem where if you have depth and no distance, you don't go anywhere. But if you have a lot of distance and no depth, you're shallow, right? So if you have a lot of distance and bad philosophy comes for you or bad politics or whatever, you're done, because you're just going to be manipulated. So you need depth. But then there's the problem with a depth that doesn't go anywhere, because then it's fragile. Like it has no impact. Like if you stay home, you can't influence. Like you, well, actually, he would just argue if you kind of can't even develop depth if you never leave home. Like that's the weird thing. Like you have to, like if you just never leave home, if you never go on the journey, you may think you have depth, you may say you have roots, but actually you just have conformity. Actually, you simply have not leaving, right? So you have to risk losing depth to gain it. You have to go somewhere to gain it. So I think basically, and this can all be expanded on, but basically, yeah, there's something about the verticality. It's like a diagonal that you're looking for, right? And the issue now, and I'll throw it to you, is we have to figure out how to have a diagonal in global pluralism with other people. And in fact, the encounter of internally consistent systems and the finding of the map, I think, has a certain organic structuring of people more in the direction of that verticality than not, actually. Because I would even argue as a giant claim, like, I don't think the Christian can be Christian unless they encounter otherness. Like, actually, their orthodoxy is made more orthodoxy in the encounter of people who don't believe, right? Like, I don't actually think you can make your Christianity itself without encounters in a loving way with people who don't believe in Christianity. I mean, Jesus is sitting with sinners, right? Now, that all has to be expanded on and gets into all the map is indestructible stuff and how actually encounters with the girdle point make the maps more so themselves. It doesn't deconstruct them. It actually makes them more themselves because maps are not the territory. So if they deny the girdle point, they're acting like there's something they're not. They're acting like they are the territory when they're not, right? So you actually need that encounter with incompleteness to realize exactly what it is you're even doing and working with, right? And that actually then makes space for the personal. Like the girdle point is necessarily personal knowledge, discernment, lived experience, encounterology, and stuff like that. There's now something to be said about also needing a constant test, like constant regular testing to see if you're too vertical or too horizontal and trying to maintain the mean. Like a constant kind of testing that you're actually needing. And this is where I think things like the social coordination mechanism is a really big deal. I will throw it back to you, but I also think a part of the problem is you talk about vanishing third places, which I just want to make a point to note. This is a very big deal. Sociology is obsessed with this. The loss of the third place is a physical location separated from the home, the first place and the second place where you work. Yeah, we don't have third places. Without third places, it is very difficult to form a mode of character and subjectivity that is not reducible either to an employee or reducible to just your function in the family. Which, of course, being a good employee is important. Fulfilling your function in the family is important. But if you don't have third places, and your kid brings something into the family that is not readily available in the home, like some question they have in the bigger world or some sort of experience, you may not have the character to handle that surprise or to know how to deal with it. And then you just tell your kid, well, don't talk about that, or repress it or avoid it, right? So third place is also, I think, well, the argument, I think third places are necessary, in fact, to do first and second place as well. And then, of course, third places are necessary for us not to just repress and banality of evil and to form community and stuff. But I'll pause and throw it to you on any thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe we could say like the internet is simultaneously like the biggest and smallest third place.
Yes.
Because there's no room for anybody to sit next to you, but you can also be in there with everybody else in the whole world.
Yep.
So that's a scale problem that we need something in between those extremes. As I was thinking about this and thinking about all the ways, and very much, I was kind of coming from that same perspective of wanting to defend a common life. And I think that now, that the one good thing I do see emerging is that we've gone so far in so many extremes that people are basically all converging on some points of agreement there. I just started reading a book, a very good book that some guy on X, he's kind of like a life coach or something, a relationship expert, and he's written this book called Sovereignty Stack, and it's basically there's supposed to be multiple editions, but the first edition came out directed at young men, and it's very much of like how you kind of fit. I would say it's a book designed to give you depth, especially within your own life, and to increase your agency, making you more aware of your inner experiences, observing the things that are going around you, figuring out how you want to orient your life. And he's I don't know. Um, he doesn't explicitly say what his faith is or anything like that. He's part of a kind of actually a new natural law institute. I don't know if you're from. Have you heard of this guy Kurt Doolittle? Yeah. I I don't know him well, but he's kind of run. This is like this institute that he's founded or whatever, and it's kind of like it's very interesting because it's rooted in science and empirical thought and rationality and all these things, but it's not. But it's jettisoned the assumptions that came in with Darwin and the thinkers of the 20th century, and it's essentially looking past that game theory problem, or saying that essentially cooperation is like a necessary ideal instead of survival of the fittest. So it's a very interesting way to look at things. But anyways, nevertheless, in this book, it's very much just assuming, hey, you want meaningful work, you want friends, you want a family, a spouse, a child, and just more or less assuming like the natural path for most people is to become adults, to be married, to have children, who can also become adults and be married and have children, so that that's the thing that causes our larger institutions with that are collaborative with other people and groups of people to grow. If you don't have the family growing, you don't have any, if you don't have reproduction, unless if we get some kind of horrible sci-fi experiment with breeding tanks or something or whatever, but otherwise, it's if we can keep the family intact, and I think people are figuring out that's so key to fulfilling all the other parts of what makes a life meaningful. This is a big topic all throughout the book. We have everything divided out: health, work, your social life, your whatever your hobbies are, and your spirituality and all these things. And it's like, well, if you have them all separate and you have to like pay or devote some time to doing all of them individually as like specialized tasks, no one can do it. But but maybe there's a better way of life that has them all more or less integrated, and you're getting all those things, and not just one. There are many successful cultures, varying degrees of success, but that's kind of the thing that that it points at. But what I was thinking about, and especially with like thinking about that growth along the kind of the diagonal between axes, but really, I've been thinking about this. Somebody pointed out to me, Jesus talking about the parable of the sower, and saying, if you don't understand this parable, how are you going to understand all the others? And what what all the others are, what he's talking about, and this is go right back to the beginning of the Bible, is it's all about seeds, and it's the way a seed, you plant it and how it grows, because a tree does that. It grows both vertically and horizontally, and actually diagonally down both ways, diagonally up both ways. It's actually really kind of a X shape or cruciform shape in many ways. And obviously the cross is very tree-like too, however you want to depict it. And so that's showing you like this, and this is like we totally depend on this. You can't, if you eliminate vegetal life, you will very quickly remove animal life from the planet, and every single seed is pointing to this stabilized image of a balanced growth in springs out into fractals. And I think you can see that even in the way that like the Bible unfolds. This say like the dispensational view of reading the Bible, if you don't get too far into your self-enclosure and make it all about charts and maps to predict the future, but just reading it like let's just read it chronologically, and then you'll see like, okay, like everybody's together after the flood. So here's Noah's law. God gives laws to Noah's. Everybody's under that. Then you have a covenant with Abraham that's more specific. And then you have a group, a contrast, those who are Abraham and those who are not. And then within Abraham, you have Isaac chosen over Ishmael. So then you have a, in a kind of Isaic covenant that includes Jacob and Esau. So they both have a little bit more of specialization. And then you go into Israel, and Israel is a nation of 12 tribes, and there's one tribe that has the priesthood. There's one tribe that has the lineage of the kings, more or less, so it's giving you all these like specialization, but you have all of the so that's the vertical, the way it's getting more vertical in growth and specificity, but you have shared horizontal with everybody, and you have more with some than with others. And then it's like, this is even an interesting thing that I was thinking about, and this is a concept I think I even mentioned in the passage, when I talk about the Samaritan Jews that still exist to this
Right.
day, literally by divine miracle, and I feel like it is for the sake of God wants us to be able to look and see, like, hey, this is a real thing, and these are real people. And, but you look at the time of Jesus, there is no group more similar to the Jews than the Samaritans, and also no group more hated.
Hated. Exactly.
And, yeah. And it's interesting because now the passage about the Good Samaritan is hard to explain, because the word Samaritan has taken on such a different meaning from how it's used. But this is the thing. This was the thing about recently. This was Jesus's intention, because that name is not a descriptive name, other than it's just associated with, it's the people that live in that place. It's a name it's an absolute choice kind of name, not a descriptive name. And so what Jesus is doing is he started a thing 2,000 years ago that said, can we hate, where somebody's saying, hey, we can hate those people, right? And he says, no, and essentially changes the meaning of what that name has come to mean to be a follower of God, which is what they really were, because they were already part of the covenant. They were chosen in the covenant. It's actually the way that, like, it's the problem that people have with the people who call themselves Jews now is the same thing. That you want to put all this description on them, but whenever you're using the name is just referring to a specific people, and you can't separate the people from the name. Like, that was the problem. If things had gone a little too far 2,000 years ago, Samaritans would have ceased to exist if certain people had their way, and they're preserved because the name, the meaning of the name came into alignment with what they were supposed to be, I guess you could say, what they were always supposed to be. So all that to say, there's obviously a lot of different things that go on with these different cultures, and I think it's fascinating. I think they all have strengths and weaknesses, and we can all learn more about our own culture, whether it's established or you're just building it from scratch, as some people are, by learning all these differences. So yeah, you study the plurality, and you also will see the difference in the depth by doing so.
No, that's magnificent. I love what you said on the Samaritan, and I think that's a fantastic. I've not thought of that, on a kind of way that Jesus actually makes the term Samaritan come into alignment with what it always was. Right? That's really fantastic. I mean, a way I've thought about it is, I think this is people hear the term Samaritan, go, oh, good. But there's, like, it's kind of scandalous what Jesus is saying. The Good Samaritan is almost the equivalent of saying, like, the sermon, like Jesus talking about the good atheist or something. It's like, what? That you can't do that? What are you talking about? And it's lost that kind of shock quality to us. I think it is also very interesting when, the question is, like, so what are the commandments? Like, love God with all your heart and love your neighbor. And of course they say, well, who's my neighbor? Like, what does it mean to be my neighbor? And he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. So it's interesting, because then the neighbor is the Good Samaritan, and he's also neighborly. So it has this kind of double function that's going on with the man on the side of the road, right? And so your neighbor, and I also think we forget that neighbor does not mean Samaritan, the guy next to you across the fence in your suburbia town, right? Neighbors often are tribes or other people who may hate you and want to kill you. So loving your neighbor as yourself can mean loving the people you hate or who want to kill you or different things. This is very radical. And the idea that these people can be good, they can do something good. What the heck does that mean? That throws out all the categories. So there is a massive, to me, upsetting of the categories. Jesus is very much, in my opinion, always upsetting the categories that do our thinking for us. Like, okay, Samaritan, bad, don't interact with. And in a way, you don't have to think, right? It's kind of more like a program, right? Like, and even with the common religion stuff, like, okay, that person is suffering, therefore they must have done bad things. I don't need to think about it. Well, you throw away that kind of karma sort of idea. You throw that away. Well, then I have to think about it. I mean, the story of Job forces you to think, right? Like all of these kind of texts mean that you can't just assume you know what is the case, right? Like, and that's also, you could say again, to go back to Hume, that is what Hume really wants to fight. Thinking that seems like thinking, but it's not. It's just, you actually don't have to think because I can just assume what is the case, right? And what I mean by that is if we've seen this in the modern world, because if I say, oh, do you have data for that? Do you have a study? No. Oh, well, I don't have to think about it then. Oh, that's just subjective. Oh, that's not a natural law. Oh, there is no freedom, just determinism. So all of these actually then bracket out variables that would force me to think, right? And force me to discern. And here's, I think, something very, very important. You don't really think except from a posture of humility. Because if you know the answer, you don't really think. It seems like you think, but really you're just kind of recalling. And actually, Joachim will talk about this about, like, we've made a big mistake with conflating memory and recall. But the point I'm getting at is a lot of what we call thinking is actually just recall that I can dismiss. Like, I don't have to think about it. Like, there is a very strong argument to be made that you don't think unless you don't know the answer and you actually are not sure. And therefore, it's fundamentally humble. David Hume sees philosophy going in the direction of extreme pride, thinking that it's thinking, when really it's more like, well, obviously he's not using this language. It's almost like an artificial intelligence in a bad way, like in a disembodied way, because it's just the ideas do your thinking for you, right? And the problem is he sees theology being something that does people's Christianity for them. He sees of people's philosophical systems as doing their thinking for them. And he's like, that's totalitarianism. That's going to lead to blind followers doing whatever they're told. And that's when you get mass violence, right? So like thinking actually can protect you from tyranny, but it has to actually be thinking, not think that it's thinking. And that requires you to not know the answers. And Jesus is so often upsetting categories. He's not letting you go with the easy answers precisely so that you think, precisely so that you have humility. And of course, that humility is then a posture toward, well, accepting Jesus as your Lord and Savior. Like if you don't have humility, you're not going to take that step. But that humility actually lets thinking be what it actually is. Thinking has a much more humble role than it realizes. But then in that humility, it's actually fuller. Like when it doesn't have a humble role, it's a lot flatter and boring and dismissing everything as mere determinism or meaningless or whatever. Like when thinking doesn't, it's funny because thinking that isn't humble is actually more boring. Like when thinking is humbling, it's actually way more interesting. Because there's an unknown. There's live situations we have to think through. That's what like Paul is doing in different things. And so to me, the Good Samaritan story is just another brilliant example of how Jesus is constantly upsetting categories and things. And you were talking about the garden rise. This part you were describing, I think, is actually really important. When you're talking about prophecy. So I'll read this, 137. A wilderness brings to mind a lack of cultivation, unrealized potential, and wasted resources. So we tend to go, okay, here's the city, this is order, and everything outside of it is chaos. Both the arid desert and the dense rainforest are wild places. Yet within each, there is a pattern of order, an interdependent relationship between the flora, the fauna, and the environment. In many ways, the wilderness is the most stable ecosystem of all. This point cannot be overstressed. There is a way that I connect prophecy with reminding the city that they're not the exclusive place of order. They're not the exclusive place of intelligibility. Actually, the problem with the wilderness is that its intelligibility is too complex for us to grasp with simple categories, with like simple order, and we can't predict it. And we have a temptation to believe if we can't predict it, it's not real, right? Like often the prophecy, of course, my bias, the prophet is bringing in the non-rationality needed to overcome the game theory. And really what ends up happening is the game theory problems, in a certain sense, have us ascribe to an order that is too simple. Like it's not the greater, more complex order, right? Like I know you were talking with Mr. Hall on the idea of like non-rational, like absolutely for me, non-rationality leads to super rational potentiality. The reason why, as we've spoken about, I emphasize the non-rational because at the time it seems crazy. It doesn't seem very supra. It doesn't seem very transcendent. It seems stupid and idiotic, right? But actually, if you take the faith and the humility to do the non-rational, which of course to you will feel irrational, that's the key as well. Like it will feel irrational to take this guy telling me that the wilderness is a place of order and to take that seriously. That just seems stupid. I know better. But actually, if I do that, then I actually get a greater rationality, if you will, that's actually able to see higher dimensionality and higher complexity and things like that. And the prophet is actually that voice for the complexity that is beyond your ability to comprehend. To remind you that the order you can comprehend is a lesser version of that fuller order, even if it historically plays a necessary role because we're not ready for the greater complexity, right? We're not ready for an order that is more like an ecosystem. So I basically think we are in an age of basically we're kind of in the transition point where we have to start having socially an order that's more like the wilderness, actually. Like to have an ecosystem that is more like the wilderness. Now, what exactly that means, we have to talk about. I do a lot on Deleuze, who I've gone through phases of my life of absolutely hating and then really realizing I misread him and then begrudgingly going, okay, he has good points, and then deciding I hate him again, but then going, I can't read. And there's something about Deleuze that when he talks about the rhizome, and transversality and all these different categories is talking about the only way to have societies that avoid capture by the surveillance state or totalitarianism is to become more like this, more rhizomatic, more. And the key is to understand that the rhizome is a stable state. It has a stability, but it is more like the stability of the gifted dancer. Does a dancer on a stage doing some remarkable routine, do they have stability? Absolutely. Is it the same kind of stability as a house? No, but it would be very foolish to say that it's not stability, right? It's a skillful kind of stability. It's an organic kind of stability, right? The problem is, you could say pride. There is something about the human being and the frenemy brain that basically has spent all of history denying that there can be order in that which I don't readily understand, or that I can't fully write down or put into equations or computer, to put into determinations that can be predicted. If I can't predict it, it doesn't exist. We already said this, right? We're at the age where we're not like basically the absolute choice, like in this sense, on the social level, is deny the reality of the order of the wilderness and suffer the consequences, or accept it and learn to adapt to that reality and to have a kind of subjectivity in society that can handle it. I do think the internet as a structure of rhizomatic connections actually almost can actually it's actually a necessary part of society that is not trying to other the wilderness, but to think itself in light of the wilderness. And I think the prophet has a role in that. Basically, based on what you were speaking with Mr. Hall, is basically we're at the age where if the wilderness continues to be othered, we get eaten alive by game theory problems. Like the wilderness we have to actually make cities that are in relationship with the wilderness, that see the wilderness as a necessary factor of the city. Now, of course, the metaphor that's part is the estuary, right? The estuary has kind of collections and then rivers, and it's going off like that. That's a rhizomatic structure with different languages. I also now am thinking about the vertical and the horizontal and the diagonal. And the other thing I've been thinking a lot about is Dr. Quinn, Josephina Quinn's book on the Silk Roads, and actually understanding the Silk Roads and actually rethinking the history of the Middle East. And there's another professor at Oxford who wrote a book called The Silk Roads. Her book is called How the World Made the West. His books is called The Silk Roads. Peter Folkson, I can't say his name, but they also are all arguing that basically our understanding of how civilizations come to be is deeply lacking. because we don't see the roads as just as much part of the cities as the cities. Now, much more needs to be said on that, but there's a kind of return to that road thinking versus, I suppose, civilization or CT thinking. Not that civilizations are bad. They become bad just like rationality when they deny the necessity of the outside, the necessity of the wilderness, right? Which then makes me think of Marcus's and their paper on institutional incompleteness, which I've been reading and really, really enjoying. But yes, I'll pause and throw it to you for any thought. But there's something about the prophet to me that is absolutely a reminder to order that they're not the only order in town. That the only order is not the quantifiable. There's a qualitative order, an organic ecosystem, a living ecosystem that is very, very important. But then, of course, the tension is there can only be roads if there are indeed cities. You can't have an estuary if you don't have gathering places. So you have to have these kind of stable states, or else it's all chaos, right? Well, that's a vertical then. Depth and horizontal, that's another vertical between roads and cities, wilderness and inside. You have to have the right mean between those two. And that makes me think of the role of the gate, which you talked about at the end. A gate of this section 141, a gate that does not open transforms a garden into a prison, but a gate that does not close turns the city into a wilderness in the bad way. What is required to stand in the doorway is a man with wisdom who can let people in and out. Yeah. You have to have that, and another language that I've used is without that function, you don't have a membrane. A membrane is something that things can enter, but it lets the bad out. We're in an age of thinking rhizomes, membranes, roads in relations to civilizations, but that right there requires a kind of diagonal person in the way we're describing. Like the person who could stand in the gate, David Hume would say, yeah, they need good philosophy. They're not just bad, they have to have good philosophy because they're going to encounter otherness. They have to live discern. They have to be able to tell what kind of person this is and how their ideas work, if their ideas are in service of them being right or in service of the community. And people can be deceptive. Like, you can't have a gatekeeper unless you have someone equipped with the discernment to do the gate well. And in the modern world, David Hume would be like, that's going to require philosophy. But philosophy also can destroy us all because it's the thing that can lead to great totalitarianism. So all of that was fantastic. But let me throw it to you on any thoughts on anything.
Yeah, so I had not been very familiar with Deleuze until I heard you introduce him, but looked him up a little bit, and of course his rhizome is a philosophical construct that's defined as specifically a thing with no directionality at all. Like that's its thing. And as I was interacting with Grok about it, saying like, the philosophers always love to come up with these hypotheticals that have no hierarchical nature, no teleological something or other, and at the end point it's like, how is this one more of these philosophical constructs whose main purpose is to make sure that humans can do whatever they want, like, and that's just like, yes, essentially it is, because in nature, like, the rhizome does have a directionality. It does have a way of sensing like what it needs. It'll grow towards where there's more moisture, more warmth, whatever. So to say, it's mostly horizontal, but it does have a certain element of verticality to it. And I think maybe you could say like the tree is really the midpoint, because there's definitely also other plants that will grow very straight up and down with almost no roots that spread out. And that's okay if it's in an environment where you don't have a lot of wind, you don't have a lot of things, whatever. But otherwise, like a lot of weeds and stuff, you just pull the whole thing right out. You just yank it out if the roots only go straight down. And so maybe in some ways it's like the prophet or the prophetic voice is bringing whichever aspect is more lacking into a certain environment. And that's why I might say you have a different kinds of wilderness. And this is even just made me think of another thing of, they've discovered that like trees, because the wilderness is so complex, like trees are not like discrete entities. They have means of communication, essentially, chemically, with other, with fungal structures and other kind of rhizomatic things that live in the soil, that network between them. and there's an exchange, sugar, the tree gives sugars from the sap, and the other things will give other kinds of minerals and things that they're actually more capable of extracting from the soil than the tree is able to do on its own. So you have like all this complexity that's working together. And when we go to construct our little stable society, we start with it's very easy to build a house with straight up and down walls and flat horizontal floors, but that's because we can understand it. We can understand it more than we can understand that whole complex mess. But then when you have some force that comes and acts on it, wind or predators or whatever, that's when you find out you need, it's like, oh, well, if you're going to, you can have a tent or build, with straight walls, but then what do? You tie ropes on it that go at a horizontal, and then you nail spikes in at an angle too. It's like, this is like how you secure things. So it's like, we're always having to kind of adapt to whatever is, however we're having some lack in the environment that we have to account for. We are adapting from the kind of structure that's not all readily present to bring it towards that more balanced position, between horizontal and vertical. So yeah, and then yeah, and then of course the gate that's very much of a Godel point kind of thing there too. So you're and it is important, I think, for people, as you've said, like that's where people need to live in there, and that's even something I was hinting at, when people go on this philosophical journey, and especially when you go real deep or whatever, it's like, I can't expect my children to relate to me on all the philosophical nuance, and so sometimes it's like, if they're asking me, what does this thing in the Bible mean? It's not appropriate for me to say, well, scholars have a variety of opinions on this, and there's many interpretations. No, it's like, it means be nice to your mother. That's what, or whatever it is, and sometimes there's good room for some of that nuance. The other day, actually, was very appropriately, my two daughters were in a Sunday school class, and the younger daughter, this was a church we were just visiting for the first time, and my younger daughter took the advantage of picking on her older sister to gain some social credit in a new environment. And I told my older daughter, I'm like, yeah, you know what? I used to do that with my brother too. I'd make fun of him in front of his friends because I was, that was the skill. I could come up with a witty joke, and I'm like, she's not trying to be mean to you. She's doing that because she feels insecure about being in a new place. She doesn't want to live in your shadow. She wants to be able to, have her own identity in there. But it was interesting because the message they were learning about was Cain and Abel. So, and I was telling my daughter, like, I was curious what, that's when they skip sometimes in Sunday school, because it's, oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's pretty it's violent, but I was telling my daughter, like, well, okay, well, like, why did God put a mark on Cain? If he did this, why didn't he just punish him? Why did he do that? He put a mark on him so that he wouldn't get hurt, to preserve his life, and then he took away his ability to grow food, the thing that he was really good at, which was really a special thing because his father had been cursed with an inability to do it well. And so everybody was looking up at him and saying, hey, this kid's got it figured out. He's figured out the problem. And then that's taken away from him. And so then how is he going to get food? What's he going to do? Well, he's got to go around and he's got to speak to people and ask for food, essentially. And every time he goes to approach somebody, like, what are they going to say? Why can't you grow your own food? And why do you have that funny mark? We don't know exactly what it looks like, but we can assume, it's a big X on his forehead or something. Why do you have, what's with that funny mark on your head? And then what's he going to do? He's going to have to tell them the story about his biggest regret. And through that one mistake, how many then other siblings and fathers and sons and people think, oh, I'm tempted to start attacking my brother when he pisses me off, but that could go really bad. So maybe I should stop and think about it. And so essentially, this I say Cain is probably the first prophet, you could say. That's the role he serves, and he's forced to live in the wilderness, and he's got these limitations that make him stand out, but he's the one that spreads the truth that God is trying to instill in that culture.
That's very interesting. I've not thought that. That's extremely interesting. And also that's a very good point with kind of, oh, you're actually good at growing, and that's taken. So that's magnificent. And yes, there also is where, like you say, there's a mark. So where'd you get that mark? So having to tell that story, and that actually can actually help people repent and not do the same thing. Right. That's magnificent. Yeah, a few things. First, yeah, what you were describing with Deleuze, this is where we get in this is the whole rhizome root issue, where in Deleuze, the whole rhizomatic structure not having direction, he's very concerned about telos, direction, and all that because he doesn't want to be captured by a totalitarian force. His main concern is capture, and power controlling people, right? It's kind of that Foucaultian, all of that kind of French milieu of trying to avoid, if you are intelligible, the government can control you. That's the risk. If you have intelligibility, you can be manipulated. You can be found. You can be captured, right? So he wants to avoid intelligibility and yet nevertheless not just be stupid, right? Because I can tell you how you can avoid intelligibility, being stupid or being mad or being crazy, but they explore that and actually talk like Foucault talking about, the normal, like being mentally healthy is just a mechanism of making you a good worker, capturable, and how actually there's a kind of revelation in mental illness, right? And that's actually kind of forms of freedom and different things. But then, of course, mentally ill people, they suffer for it, right? So what is and that gets into things with Lorenzo on neurodiversity, game theory, and all of that different stuff. But there's a cheap Deleuze and there's a costly Deleuze. I do think the main mistake, Deleuze toward the end of his life, I think becomes much more interested in negativity. We don't have to get into this at all. The great Terence Blake will talk about that. I think the key principle that Deleuze did not bring out is the term transversality. And what he would want to say is, no, the rhizome does not have direction, but in its growth, there's the possibility of emergence. There's no telos, but there can be an emergence of something new that is surprising. So it's creative possibility. So he's going to be big on emergence. And now we have complexity science talking about emergentism. That's talking about, chemistry emerges into biology. We've heard this with Vervaeke, Henriquez, Bard, people like that. And Deleuze is certainly, and Snowden talks about it, Deleuze is certainly kind of a forerunner of what is now called nude materialism, which is the idea of materialism entails this fundamental creative possibility of emergence, and emergence can kind of develop. Now, nevertheless, I don't think it's by chance that most Deleuzians, who I think most of them are cheap Deleuzians, end up hikikomori, unable, isolated, because they're different, they're unique, but they can't handle encountering otherness because they don't have any roots to hold them in place. Or Deleuze ends up destroying the social order because there's no shared intelligibility. So, yeah, you can't be captured by the state, but you also don't have enough shared intelligibility to make meaningful connections with other people to form society. So ultimately, it ends up serving the individual at the expense of the middle, at the expense of the social, right? Which, of course, the entire Deleuzian project is trying to avoid serving forms of neoliberalism and stuff like that, right? But ultimately, it becomes extremely much in its favor. Furthermore, there are arguments against Deleuze that it unintentionally ends up supporting the very fascism that it's trying to avoid, because if people don't have any social connections, because they don't, they're rhizomatic, but their rhizome is their rhizome and other people's are theirs, and they can't connect because they have an essential difference that is not intelligible and thus is protected, but thus is alone. And so what ends up happening is in that people get upset and they become susceptible to fascism, which then tends to define itself by a characteristic of the rhizome like race or something like that. So these are all critiques levied at cheap Deleuze. which I think gets us into a lot. And then, of course, the alternative to Deleuze is more going to be on the Lacanian psychoanalytical side that I think provides very strong resources. No need to get into this to deal with the neurotic, the big other, the totalitarian dictator, the problems of failed desire that C.S. Lewis talks about in The Weight of Glory. But psychoanalysis is not so good with dealing with the issue of psychosis, which is basically the isolated individual with their own internally consistent system that can be referred to as weak speech. And so they struggle to form the social. So basically let me put it this way to make a very gigantuous claim. All of the major movements in recent philosophy, modern philosophy, certainly up to the year 2001, have been efforts to keep there from being another totalitarian dictator, another Nazism, another Stalin or whatever. But they did so through a metaphysics that sacrifices the social. And no one has been able to regain the social. So now the question is, okay, how do we take seriously what Deleuze is saying about capture and all of that, but have a root of which allows depth and social intelligibility with other people. So that gets the giant root and rhizome. I think the key is a lot. Katajan, Jockin talks about this. Realizing the true character of intelligibility via analogical reasoning, which is a giant thing. But the debate between root and rhizome is kind of like ground zero of the main metaphysical debate, that if we can't figure it out, we're in massive trouble. And basically, root and rhizome is 100% connected to map and girdle point stuff as well, because the map is what provides the intelligibility, the shared intelligibility, but it also creates the risk of capturing you in that internal consistency, or keeping people captured in that crystalline structure and they can't handle otherness. All of these are kind of analogically related. And to look at, and that's where we're so interested in comparing Locke between Lacan and Aristotle, and also thinking about Deleuze with people like Katajan and people like that, and the Church Fathers and so forth. But the thing I also wanted to say is, on that gatekeeper, who is absolutely, for me, dwelling in the girdle point, there is something to be said that there's people who perhaps their job involves the girdle point, standing at the gate. I would say the average person has to be enough familiar with the girdle point that they don't freak out when they encounter it. Like, it may not be their job to kind of work the gate, but if you're not even able to accept that there is a gate, then you're going to board it up. And now you have an internally consistent system, right? So I think the average person, increasingly in global pluralism, has to be, in terms of their nervous system and their intellectual life and all of that, able to not freak out with the reality of otherness. Now, does that mean every single person needs to manage the gate? Well, I think there is plenty of room for various expertise, but there is something to be said about everyone now has to be okay with there being a gate. If you're not okay with there being a gate, then you're gonna wall it out, or you're gonna tear down the walls, and then it's all wilderness, like you said, right? So to me, like, I think it's a very important point you're bringing at. There is something to be said about a certain, like, your job is the girdle point, or your job, and you're doing it on behalf of the community, but the community needs to be comfortable with the realities of girdle points and gates, or else they're going to tear it down, and they're actually going to think you're wasting your time. That job you have standing at the gate, that's a wasted thing. Actually, you're enabling the bad guys to come in. You're actually, like, defending a way that they can break out. You're really inconsiderate. You doing that philosophy is just making things complex when they don't need to be. We don't even need this gate. Why do we need this gate? We got everything we need inside. Everyone in here is on the same page. Why do we have this gate? So, and they'll get rid of the gatekeeper. And then internally consistent system, it's all locked from the inside like hell, and entropy sets in and it eats itself, right? So I think the stakes are very high. The thing also, I guess, for why, like, I think the internet plays a really big role in this, because like, what we're talking about on the mean, because not middle, mean, like the right fittedness between city and wilderness, horizontal and vertical, map and girdle point, the incompleteness, but not losing authority, because if you do that, you end up in trouble, right? All of the, like, how to have enough exposure to the other that you're not closed-minded, but not so much that you're then losing the ability to stand on your own 2 feet, right? So what's very critical about all this, all these different tensions, and I think, again, your book is just, I've got a lot of stuff, like I always do in the, like, just all these pages. So like prophecy and culture, the static, I've got a bunch of, like, doggy ears. And I also love this section on local opportunities. But what I was going to say is, there's all this language now, like, if you pay attention to people, they'll all say something like, you know, oh, there's a place for both Republicans and Democrats. Like, oh, it's both freedom and also restriction. Like the bothness language. If you listen to political discourses or online, there's an acknowledgement that you need both, right? More and more you'll hear that, rather it be, you need both liberal and conservatives. You need both freedom and restraint, on and on, right? Now, people will say that and then practically in their life act the opposite, of course. But generally, you'll notice that the dialogue very often people will acknowledge the other side enough to at least suggest that they are aware that their perspective needs the other side, right? Democrats will do that, Republic. Now, I would argue this is actually often just using the girdle point for indestructibility because you're going through the motions of incompleteness, but actually using that to not question your mouth. So there can be a devious side of that, and it becomes performative. That's why the girdle point is the choice either to acknowledge incompleteness or to create indestructibility. You say, my map is not the territory, but yours isn't either. And we need lots of maps, but I don't need to actually change mine. Because, we all just kind of agree to the fact that our maps are not the territory, but that means I don't have to change. So you can actually use it to kind of lock yourself in, right? But the point is this, you have increasingly this language of bothness going on, the need to have both. You can't just do the computer, you also need the community. You can't just have the individual, you'll hear all of this. Now, without going into perhaps, I think I have been completely convinced, despite my earlier years' hatred of Hegel, I have been convinced that The Science of Logic is like a really, really important book. And I would say to people, if you go to read it, read the remarks between the sections. The sections are incredibly difficult to read, but the remarks are not. And you should look at the sections between the remarks as basically him doing, like, figuring out as he goes, right? He's like live thinking. He's like showing his work. Okay, so he's showing his work, but it's all captured in the remarks, or in my opinion, the great remarks. I think that's a secret to Hegel. Like a lot of Hegel that's impossible to read need to be seen as him like showing his work to how he got to his conclusions. Well, you read the preface of the Phenomenology of Spirits. I don't think the preface is very easy to read, actually. I think it's very straightforward. Is it easy to read? It's not. It's a complicated text, but it's very straightforward. And the preface captures the spirit of what he's getting at in the whole. Now, I'm not saying every detail is there, but the secret, in my opinion, to Hegel is reading the remarks and then seeing the sections between the remarks as him doing the work as he goes. But the overall point I'm trying to, that I want to say is a stress in Hegel is that everything is dialectical. Now, what does he mean by dialectic? He does not mean like A and B and we go back and forth. No, what he means is that everything is ontologically in itself dialectical. It becomes otherness. There is a point where freedom becomes slavery. There is a point where a seed becomes a tree. There is a point where an embryo becomes a human being. It is not like a back and forth like in a debate. Like you'll defend liberalism, I'll defend conservatism, we'll have a dialectic going. No. That's a form of dialectic that is more rhetorical. He wants to argue that becoming other is in things themselves. Like they become other, right? Well, this is a major problem then. Because if what's a good idea today becomes a force of totalitarianism tomorrow, then are we screwed? Sure sounds like it. Sure sounds like we're in massive trouble. So what you have to do for Hegel is engage in speculative reason to determine at what point of the dialectic you're at and to basically shift it or to move it. Like when I say shift it, like if freedom eventually becomes slavery, you need to pay attention to notice when it's starting to become slavery and change its directionality or bring in a new value or bring in a new dimension or bring a new quality, right? So for example, if let's go back to the horizontal and vertical. You're paying attention, you're saying, we're becoming too horizontal. So let's go back to vertical. We're becoming too vertical. So going back to, so you're like driving a car trying to stay on the road, okay? Trying to stay on the road. For Hegel, philosophy is not about thinking dialectics, but more so navigating dialectics, more so discerning how to live, how to keep the car on the road, dang it, like speculative reason, how to actually like not have your life decided by the dialectic. Because people make the point all the time, if it's all dialectical, well, who cares? Eventually you have to make a decision. Yes, exactly. That's why you have this massive section on judgment. The problem is how do you make good judgment if everything passes into its opposite, passes into otherness? Because what you judge is good today, tomorrow could be bad, right? So you have a major problem. So this is my argument. You have to be constantly testing, constantly objecting. Like there is no, like if I were to say well, if at any moment you could be in a car wreck or in any way kind of mess up, then do you never drive? No, it just means you have to like learn and have a certain skill and pay attention, and you'll make mistakes, but then you try again and you get better, right? Like the fact that there's no end to driving would not mean that therefore driving doesn't exist, or the fact that you don't have like a one way to drive that does all driving in all circumstances would not mean the skill is not valid, right? So philosophy becomes much more kind of discernment in keeping the car on the road, right? Well, so I think it is that, like between city and wilderness, like but between all of the, I and otherness, it's a constant. How do I keep my car on the road, right? Well, here's the problem: we we don't know how. Actually, we don't know how. Thinking doesn't know its end ahead of time, so you need a system of constant testing. Constant testing. So my giant claim with the social coordination mechanism is that basically the name of the game is to use the internet to constantly engage in testing. Like this is always what thought was supposed to be in the business of, is finding the mean between them. Like thinking again. Let's talk about it again. We're heading low. Go back. And it can never stop. Like, you know how people talk about the great conversation? Like, what is the point of the great conversation? It's to keep the car in the middle of the road. Oh, and by the way, it changes in the what year is it? 2026. It's different than 2010 and 2030. So you have to keep conversation going. So, like likewise, we're constantly in the same. The pricing mechanism allows us to test material goods, and it's a constant test, right? The reason why you create wealth is because of the test, right? Like you need the constant testing. We know what happens if you don't have a pricing mechanism or a system of competition and a system of experimentation that the entire capitalist system does. You get crap. It's bad. It doesn't work. You need it, right? The argument is that's what's actually happened in ideas. Like that's why most philosophy has been bad philosophy. Most theology has been bad theology because you haven't had a mechanism of the constant testing by which to actually keep us in the mean. So likewise, like so much of life is actually finding just better articulations for things you already knew that then free you. You're like, now I see. Like I already knew that, but now I see. And the wording has a kind of release function to it, right? So one of the things we do online is constantly look for new articulations, new ways to say things, and then we get it. Oh, I intuited that, but now I got it, right? Now the car's in the middle of the road, right? Now the car's in the middle of the road, right? So what one is doing, so the reason why I say all this is because, and I would just argue that thinking and civilizational design, everything has always been in the business of this, finding the mean, but we have not had an effective mechanism by which to do it well, because that would require the social coordination mechanism. And then the work you're doing on AI, I think, is a massive potential help to actually finding that mean. And we just haven't had the infrastructure to continually do it. And the reason why I think this is very important, I'll throw it to you. The reason why I think this is very important is because if you think what's happening online is arriving at the conclusion or the best theology or the best philosophy or the best ideas, right? Then you're not, then you're not going to understand it's actually a perpetual testing, a perpetual searching of the best articulation, which you need it forever because new circumstances arises, new technologies arises, new ideas arise, right? Like new things are going to happen that you need to think. Like Cadell will talk about philosophy as, thinking, philosophy is the thinking of the moment, right? Like AI did not exist 30 years ago. Now AI does. You have to decide what you're going to do about that. And, you have to decide what you're going to do and what that means about being human, right? You didn't ask for it. No, you didn't, but it's coming, right? And you have to somehow keep the car in the middle of the road because you're going to have to force to make a choice. And it will be easy to say it's demonic and throw it out or to not think about it at all. So you go off the road, right? Well, what's the fitting way to think about it? Well, I need to keep testing. Oh, and by the way, I better talk with people who are not me, because they'll probably have ideas that I don't know, and you keep testing and you're keeping the car on the road. If you do not do this, you're going to end up in bad philosophy or bad technology, manipulative technology. You're going to end up in bad politics. You're going to take the car off the road. You're not going to be able to. So you have to have that constant test. The last thing I'll say and then throw it to you is the way I think about it is the internet as a constant test between the ratio of usefulness and accuracy. And it's the map problem, right? If you have a map that is 100% correct, it's useless. It's too complex. It's too big, right? If it's as big as the terror, you can't use it. So you literally need the map to be wrong. But if it's too wrong, then it doesn't work. So you need to find a trade-off between correct and use, right? In a way, that's the same as vertical and horizontal. You want to know to what degree it corresponds with ultimate reality, but then to what degree it can be horizontal, right? So it has to find the mean. The map has to find the mean between accuracy and correctness. But what is that? How do you know? You have to keep testing it. You keep testing the model over and over again. And it's different percentages at different times and different ratios. You keep doing it and doing it and doing it. So it goes with social engagement. So it goes with the relation between wilderness and civilization. So it goes map and girdle point. So it goes with everything. And the internet is, in my opinion, to reach its fullness when it has that mechanism of testing between the ratio of, say, use and correctness or wilderness and city. And that has always been, because again, you can't just say it's both. I guess that's what I'm saying. Everyone's like, oh, I'll say it's both, and that's check mark, right? Conservatives and liberals are both right. These things are no, you can't say it. You have to live it. You have to have a space in which you encounter it and you develop. You need an environment in which the bothness becomes a reality to you. And the question is, what percent is it both? Is it 70% conservative and 30% liberal, 70% road and 30% civilization, or 28 or whatever, right? What's the exact ratio? Is it 50-50? It is not 50-50. It depends on the situation. Maybe it's 50-50 sometime, but probably sometimes 82 and 18 and other percent. Well, you need the testing to keep the car on the road. You have to do the testing. So the social coordination mechanism is the only way, and I'll stop. It's the only way, if you're dealing with an increasingly complex, interconnected global world, then that's going to be throwing out new problems at you than ever thought. You have to have a mechanism to continually test each situation, each ratio, each articulation over and over again, or you're going to end up in bad philosophy. You're going to end up in an eternally consistent system. You're going to end up in a game theory problem, right? You've got to keep testing because you don't know the right way to go before the test. Before the test, you don't know. Because by definition, you're going to think whatever you think is the right way to go. But the problem is you're full of self-deception and can't know that other than your own just kind of ideas that you've absorbed, right? You can't help but think what you ought to do is the thing you ought to do, right? That's the problem. You need something to test it. That isn't going to test it in a way that if you fail, the game's over, like you die or something. You need a way to test it when there's still time to test so that you can adjust. That's what the social coordination mechanism can do. And if AI can help people find the girdle point or not have arguments unnecessarily and all the stuff that you've been working on, all of that profoundly aids the ability to find these means in all of these circumstances that are bothness. And good philosophy is going to be found in that mean. It's going to be found. It's in service of that mean. I'll throw it back to you, sir.
No. Well, okay, so this is not in the book, but this is some things I'd written on and continue to think about, and I just put out one of those little videos on an essay that I cut into 3 parts on the parables in Luke 15 and 16, but specifically thinking Luke 15 because it's 3 parables about these distinct groups. You got 100 sheep, 1 is lost. You got 10 coins, 1 is lost. You got 2 brothers, 1 is lost. But in each of those ones, it is it's a triangulation story. The 2 brothers have 1 father that connects them. The woman looking for the coins is connected to both the coins in her hand and the one she can't find, and likewise the sheep are connected by a shepherd. So and however you want to put it, that's if maybe you can put yourself in that role as a mediator, a mature person can, but you may also be one of the other parties. And I think really the map, what comes into it is that the maps obviously belong to the people, and you have different maps. I mean, the coin one, well, I guess you could say if the face on the coin, if the eyes can see what they're looking at, that one's the one that's under the bed is looking at something else than what the other 9 coins are looking at. But certainly with the brothers, they have 2 different perceptions of reality. And the point that was most interesting to me, and I think maybe this is to say, just a little detail that the shepherd leaves the 99 sheep in the wilderness.
Yes.
Sheep, 99% of the sheep can survive in the wilderness. How do they survive in the wilderness? Maybe with a map. The map is up to 99% effective, but it's not perfect. And so that's why that 1 sheep is missing, and the point I kind of made in those essays is like, oh, well, this is maybe the point of the prophet or the neurodivergent person or whoever, because everybody's looking at the map and can't diagnose the problems with the wilderness because they're trapped in the map. So it's only that very small minority who can see what is wrong with the wilderness, where where it doesn't connect to the map. So that's why it's always important to have that. But in those other ones, what I noticed was that they do represent different social kind of structures. Because if you have 1 in 10%, that's a stable minority. If you have a group of, in 10 families or 10 men is the minimum for a prayer group to have a synagogue. So that's like as an absolute number, 10 has some significance there. It was also like the smallest unit in the Roman legions. The legion of 100 was broken up into groups of 8 to 10 little I forget what they call them, but anyways, and so that's like, and it's if the majority gets if they can't maintain that, then they're going to dissolve. But once you get past that point, 10%, 20%, whatever, you can that's where you are in that place of you require the other to define yourself. You're defining yourself in opposition to the majority. It's a majority minority position. And that's really useful for a lot of things. It is good that we do need that in a lot of our social groups and settings. And then, with two brothers, then you get up to, well, then you're at a 50-50 split. And then it's, it's war or whatever, essentially, either you have peace or you have war. You figure out how to live together, or, you're going to be in the Cain and Abel problem there. So it's either Jacob and Esau learn how to live on their own land, and they meet together to bury their father, or you're Cain and Abel, and one is no more, and he regrets it afterwards. And then of course with 99 and 100, that's when you get you get the scapegoat problem, because as soon as you get rid of that problematic one, the 99 are going to find that 98 don't agree with. There's 98 that seem to get along with. There's another guy that's also problematic, and you can go down that road until you get to 1 in 10 or 1 in 1 or however. So it's like there's, I don't know exactly to say, but maybe then to say it is the person there who is in that triangulation position, which is the Christ one, and also Christ calls himself the gate too. He is the gate. So you need that. You need to have that. You need to. So I guess that's one of the points of going deep or whatever, and having that verticality is that you can at least transcend. You can stand above some level, whatever, and obviously it's like parents are above children. And so parents can't just live with the children as a child. They have to remain as a parent to help the children not kill each other. And so, similarly, we can take that principle into other roles. So that's one of the reasons why I need that depth. And then it's a sacrificial way of living, because you maybe always want to be spending time with the people that are at your same level of depth. Maybe you can if there's somebody else above you, but if you're at the top, that's Jesus. Jesus took that. He's at the top spot, and he's already put himself into that position or whatever. But that's kind of the role that we are mimicking, I guess, in that way, or we can if we choose to. There's something else I was going to say about that. Oh, well, so. Okay, so one thing I think is interesting is that it's if you have those majorities or those different splits working correctly, then you have that mediator. The mediator he's the one that can see both maps,
right?
And he can see you can see the territory, and you can see the different maps, because the thing is that none of the maps are perfect. But they all have something to add, and that's why the problem is when we're in conflict with. My map is focused on the rivers and getting the rivers right, and yours is focused on getting the mountains right. Well, we're never going to see eye to eye. But if somebody can say, no, the rivers and the mountains are both important, they both have their place, then we can get along, because we can agree to disagree, or we can be at peace with our own, unique special interests. So, because that's the thing. That's even to say that like, the maps are incredibly useful. We need to meet. We should have more maps. We should collect maps. We should study many maps, because that's how you get a better, unless if you have that omniscient view, that's really the best thing that we can do, is to meet our neighbor and share our maps with each other. I guess you could say, probably. So
Absolutely. When you realize the map is not the territory, that means you actually can be open to many maps, which increases the likelihood you'll have the mental models and tools needed for the unique circumstances you come upon, right? And there is something to be said about the necessity of the realization of the map is not the territory. I do think is historically contingent upon complexity and the likelihood of encountering things that would make you realize that, or situations that are not covered by the map that you were given, right? And most of the maps that people have historically have been religions, which are extremely compressed languages that allow an unfolding into other circumstances. I know you were noting this at the beginning a little bit, but like, for example, the Bible, like, if the Bible contained quantum mechanics and all possible ideas that would ever turn out to be true, it would be unreadable. And it wouldn't have made sense to people in history, and it wouldn't be with us today. And yet there's something about the Bible that actually, through time, there's a kind of opening up of the zip file of all of the things that we're actually entailed with. It's not so much adding to the Bible, it's unzipping the zip file, right? I mean, there's a sense in which I suppose there's adding quantum mechanics, but there's another sense in which actually that was always in there in a certain capacity, right? And I think basically, like, there's something also about changing your relationship to the map that allows a kind of zip file relationship to things that actually means your map contains the multiplicity space for many maps and many different mental models that don't. People think if you bring in new maps, that means the other maps are deconstructed or they're not as valuable. And it's like, no, all of them actually can be contained in the same zip file that's just kind of open. That is reality. That is opening up with time. And there are different maps that kind of facilitate that more so than others. I think also what you're talking about, a stable minority, is a very big deal. And again, going back to and again, I guess to give Deleuze credit, there is that idea that if you don't have people of whom are outside what is considered normal, the system will become entropic. Like, if the community doesn't have any neurodivergency, to use that language, if it has no line of flight, then it will become stable. It will become a stable state, and stable states are entropic. Like, they're actually, weirdly, stable states are the least stable. Like, the most stable are like environments, like you pointed out, but they're not quote unquote stable states. There's lots of difference and unpredictability. The more predictable the unit is, the more it seems stable, but actually it's dead. The most predictable thing's a dead body, right? So, that's what you end up doing. And so Deleuze is pointing to that. The problem is there is not a mechanism to which the one can enter the 10, the minority can enter the majority, and the majority understand them, or the minority know how to make themselves intelligible to the whole. This is where a religious tradition saying listen to the prophet is a big deal, because if someone you don't understand comes to your midst, but at least you're part of a tradition that says, hey, love your neighbor, prophet, could be an angel, there's like, don't assume, that can actually help make space for the minority and the one you don't understand, because you believe in a God who can surprise you. If you don't believe in a God, it perhaps can be more difficult to do that, right? Or because people have to say, why bother dealing with the energy, use to deal with this person? Well, because God told you to. Oh, okay. If you don't have that, it can become more difficult. But nevertheless, there is something about Deleuze that I think is pointing to this problem. The issue becomes you need a mediator, like you said. But then the issue is, people would say, well, if there's a mediator, there's a dictator imposing their notion of mediation upon other people, right? You run that on, they're determining the ratio. That's why you need an infrastructure of constant testing the mediation, and the mediation constantly being tested and revisiting and rethinking it. Like, you need this system of flows to keep it going, right? This is the Silk Roads that was needed for the civilizations not to eat themselves, right? Like you have this wonderful chapter on static culture. And alas, my friend, I do have to take my daughter to, I probably have soccer practice this evening. I don't know where the time goes, but we made it to like chapter 10. So it is like pick up. Now I think we're gonna get to 14. Because when you're talking about the static culture, basically, if you don't have a mechanism of constant testing, you're going to get a static culture. And it's going to be static if it doesn't have the prophet. Well, how do you have the prophet that is able to be heard by the people? So they change, like a Nineveh or something like that, right? Well, the people have to be open to it. They have to be open enough to the girdle point that if they encounter it, they don't blow up, right? So for whatever reason. And or they need a mediator to help them see the role, to navigate the system, right? But that mediator and the whole ecosystem as a whole also needs an infrastructure of constant testing so that mediation itself does not get absorbed into the static civilization. So that because the knowledge of the girdle point could itself become part of a map. It could itself become part of an internally consistent system. Like knowing the map, here's a big problem. Knowing the map is not the territory could actually just become part of your map, and not a kind of lived personal knowledge that you're encountering and experiencing, right? But no one, by merely telling themselves not to make that mistake, can therefore avoid that mistake. They need a constant community that they're encountering, a constant mechanism of testing, a constant like restating, encountering something new. So you need a Silk Roads, you need a social coordination mechanism, or you're going to get a freaking static culture, as you write about so well. And also that stuff on Daniel that you were mentioning with it, that's so good. And then I guess it does feed directly into the boomer morality, because something like the boomer morality is what you get when you get a static culture. And it's not by chance. I know we talked about this in previous conversations. I just wanted to touch on it. Like that do not judge. That kind of follows if you don't have a social coordination mechanism that trains judgment, that trains it into being live discernment by which you discern new circumstances and know how to think about it, right? And yet, nevertheless, you need judgment or you're done because you can't think live situation. So there's been forms of morality that I think have formed in light of a lack of logistical and coordination infrastructure that is inadequate and led to all sorts of pathologies, but also formed in light of not having that infrastructure as part of the ecosystem by which to make sure judgment doesn't slip into judgmentalism or slip into a dictator or slip into a top-down big other. And therefore, a lot of boomer morality, I do think, generally reflects libertarian neoliberalism. I think a lot of it has that kind of libertarianism to it. And of course, it would be a giant claim, but the metaphysical notion of the individual is kind of a metaphysical defense against totalitarianism, the defense of the individual, in a Ayn Rand or a Murray Rothbard or something like that. But the problem is you lose the social in that. And if you lose the social, you lose, well, everything we need to be human. So we have to regain the social without creating the circumstances by which the dictator can come back, by which the totalitarian force can come back, right? And that means you have to regain discernment. You have to regain live circumstances, and therefore you also need an infrastructure by which to constantly train and test discernment, right? Constantly re-engage. So this space, so again, I'm sorry, and I'll give it to you for any thoughts on anything before I have to run and forget. I don't know where the time goes. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and we will talk again because now we're like at page 215. So we'll just keep going. So I like it, but like, we have to see the internet or like all of these spaces, Voicecraft, TLC, etc., Philosophy Report, like this, like what are we doing? Like what are we doing? People can have like, what are we doing? Right? Because there's like this risk of if we're online, it's big and it's small. It's like the worst third space, but also the best third space. I think if you understand what the internet is supposed to do, it can help, because what the internet is supposed to be doing as a social coordination mechanism is provide a constant test between use and accuracy, a constant test between the mean of the vertical and the horizontal, a constant test of the mean between the city and the wilderness. And it must never end. It can never end. No more than the market can ever end. No more than the pricing mechanism can ever end. These systems cannot end. They're nervous systems. Like your nervous system can't stop. If it stops, you die. This is a social nervous system to deal with the problem of means that necessarily follows from a dialectical reality where all things eventually pass into their otherness and become self-effacing and auto-cannibalistic or game theory crap or whatever. So you have to have this constant testing. If you know that, The reason why that's a really big deal for me, because it also means you need this so that your in real life communities don't get screwed by ending up in game theory problems and Nass equilibria. All as you know about the problem of Nass equilibria. Here's the problem. You can know about all of the game theory problems, but without the constant testing and ratio, your idea of how to address them will eventually pass over into otherness and not work. So you have to constantly do it. Now, does that mean you do it literally every single day? Of course not. You don't like go to the gym 24/7 or whatever. You have nice balances, but this social coordination mechanism is a inseparable part, well, should be an inseparable part of your life, no more than exercise is. People hear that and say, what are you saying? We have to use the internet for it. People are using the internet constantly anyway. Like you can't, like you're using the screen constantly anyway. The question, and you basically have to, if you're going to have a job or connect or whatever, right? So that's a reality. The question, or you can say, no, technology is evil and I don't want it, but that's, of course, denying the dialectical character and isolationist or whatever. The question is how to use the internet that you're already using a lot and make sure you're using it in a way that is dealing with what I would argue is the most difficult sociological reality of all, which is finding the mean, but in the dialectic of all of these different issues, that if you lose, you get auto-cannibalism, entropy, and all the different problems. And that requires a content infrastructure. We want to use the internet to service this extraordinarily difficult sociological problem of finding the mean between givens and releases, map and Gödel point, and all those different things, and to really focus on the internet being about that. Does that mean you can't have Wikipedia articles and stuff like that? No, but all of that is in service for the work of the mean, not consuming content so that you can win at trivia night, but so that you find new articulations by which to get the mean, or new ways of thinking to get the mean, to release the energy, to deal with things. Constant testing of that. We use the internet like a social coordination mechanism as such, and we use AI to help with that work. We have the nervous system, the infrastructure by which to deal with the most difficult problems in all of sociology, politics, and so forth, that until this moment in history, you could argue we didn't have to address because we were more isolated and whatever. There were givens. Now we do, and so, or the consequences are effing dire. They're really dire. So I'll throw it to you for anything, sir.
Well, so as you were talking about that, I was kind of thinking about this way that things have been unfolding through history, and I'll go back to the Piraha. I think they're like the example of the most vertically integrated culture, and there's some really interesting and the interesting thing to think about is that so like if you take boomerality and then what comes after it is like wokeness, or what the Collins call, the urban monoculture.
Monoculture, right.
That is a culture that requires a shallowness because it's always added on. That's right. Nobody's native culture. Like the Piraha, and this is one of the thing that was like, oh, this was the most mind-blowing thing when I heard it, is he realized that Daniel realized that their language, which is so simple that it's very hard to like be creative really, because it's so limited in its words and phrases and phonemes and all this, but it was also very complex because it could be expressed in different modes. It could be spoken, it could be like whistled or kind of screamed, or it could be hummed. And he talked about how he was watching a mother nursing her baby, looking at a magazine, like a nature magazine with a picture, I think it was a picture of a whale or something, and he realized that she was humming to the baby, who has not learned how to speak yet. And she was not only conveying a melody that's comforting, the humming is a very soothing thing to babies, with the vibration, but she was also conveying information about the physical images and all these things, and it like that she was seeing on the page. So it's like when you realize like that the rootedness of that is so strong that nothing can break that chain. Now it's also, their culture is also very much tied to like, we are the people that live on this patch of the river, this piece of land, the jungle's that way, and the river's this way, and that's how life is. So if you move that, then their culture is going to fall apart pretty quickly. But it's like they can't learn numbers. It's like once you become 6
Right.
years old or something. It's like their brain is turned off from learning
Yeah.
numbers. So it's like so vertical, you can't do anything. So it's like, and if you think about like, okay, well, this is how things were in these Stone Age times. We've gotten to a place where we've really, really reduced that down. So now people are very open. We we downplay and deny those basic things that, you know, you were a dependent baby nursing at your mother's breast. That is like a common life. That's, you know, the basis of your natural law. It's better to be alive than it is to be dead. It's better to have food than to not have food. You know, it's like this, you know, we can start from there. But 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 we've gone so we've reduced the verticality, and we've gone so far in the
Yeah.
horizontal that I don't know. I'm almost like not scared of like I think it would be so hard for like a totalitarian regime to come. Well, I mean, even Francis Schaeffer said this. He said, "Don't expect the strong man. That's not going to be the totalitarian regime of the future. It's going to come through propaganda, manipulation, and increasingly,
Sure.
probably just a machine that just gives you pleasure." You know, we're like
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
knocking levels off of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It just people are living down there. It's just going to be, you know, whatever, food tubes and pornography or whatever, and that's all there's going to be. There's going to be, which is scary, but that's also not. That is in some sense because we've lost that vertical rootedness. It means that people are fertile ground if you give them a positive message, a seed, a cultural seed, a gospel message, you know, in some sense, a picture of how things are actually supposed to grow. That I think the winner will be the best vision. And I think this is what Jordan Hall was saying essentially with like the to break the Nash equilibria between competing AIs, it's going to be the one that chooses virtue, that
Yeah.
emphasizes trust, you know,
Hmm.
that embodies a biblical or a Christian morality in some sense. It's like that's the one that's going to win. So that's something good for the future. It's just, hey, let's just get ahead of that. You know, we don't have to doubt so much. Like we have enough of that common life that we've tested the alternatives to know enough. Yet no, let's stick with marriage. You know, the normal family, parents raising their kids, teaching them these things. You know, food, learn how to grow food, whatever. Like we have enough of a core that I think we can look back and say you it doesn't go well if you don't have that, and that's a building place that allows a lot of commonality between people who might have very different uh, philosophies, religions, etc. So
Absolutely beautifully said, and I always love speaking with you. It is tense before temples. To what you were saying, I strongly believe that people use AI in service of the social coordination mechanism, as you've been working on. That will be the best form of AI, and the AI that is not will just be Nicklandian replacement of human beings via manipulation and versus conviviality, as Ivan Illich says, et cetera, so forth. So I think this is very important. It really matters how we use it. I think also just as some final notes. The only way, so the name of the game is a creative verticality, and verticality can only be creative if you return to it. Otherwise it's stagnant. So verticality is naturally stagnant. That's the common life you never leave. It's stagnant. It's not creative. So you need to go in order to make it creative. But the problem is when people go, they don't tend to come back, right? So then they get horizontal that's shallow, and if it's shallow, it can't be creative. But if it's vertical and it never leaves, then it's stagnant, right? A vertical creativity is one you return to. And that's why the return is a really, really big deal. And you know, for me, verticality I associate with belonging. I associate horizontal with meaning. I do not think belonging and meaning are the same thing. Ironically, if you don't return, the horizontal doesn't even feel meaningful. That's the weird thing. Like if you never go horizontal, you actually don't get meaning. Like and this is, I think, extremely important because people think, oh, if I would have, because there's a lot of association now with meaning and getting roots again and returning home and stuff like that. And all of that is true, but you had to leave, you had to have the return. And then that kind of retrospectively makes the horizontal meaningful. It can create the effect that you should have never done the horizontal. You should have just stayed the vertical. But no, you actually had to return to it. So what I'm saying is that ultimately humans are not happy or fully themselves unless you get both belonging and meaning. You have to get both. And then in belonging and meaning, belonging actually feels like belonging versus stagnancy versus boredom and all that. And meaning actually feels like meaning versus just doing new things that are interesting. Like what is the difference between this deep rooted meaning versus, oh, that's interesting. Oh, I'll do something new. Oh, that's cool, right? That kind of doing something cool that's interesting becomes meaning when it returns to a verticality. And that's also a critical idea for Hume, is like if philosophy doesn't return to common life, it's almost as if you never did philosophy. Likewise, if meaning doesn't come back, if the horizontal doesn't come back to the vertical, it's almost like you didn't even do the horizontal because everything you did was shallow and paper thin and didn't mean anything, right? And yet the very reason you did them is because you thought they were meaningful. You thought they were interesting. You thought they would do something, right? So that return, it's all about the freaking return. And the return now, of course, does not mean you necessarily go home and live where you grew up. You return from a journey. You stop being nomadic. You stop being doing new things. You invest in something. You plant yourself. You return to something and invest in it, right? And that unlocks, like if you never return, then all the creative possibility of all the stuff you did horizontally is never unlocked. Like all of the potential of all the things you did, the fullness of it never comes out. It's the return that actually kind of makes all the stuff you did blossom, right? And become part of a story, right? But you have to have that return. And that's where belonging and meaning come together. New Jerusalem, in my opinion, is a creative verticality. Eden could not be a creative verticality unless it was returned to, per se. And of course, by return, it's new. Like New Jerusalem is a return to Eden, but it's not a return to Eden at the same time. There's a sense where you never return to Eden. You fulfill Eden, right? There's a fulfillment to it, right? So return is a language of fulfillment as well. And you get into Hegel's retrospective history and all of that different stuff. But you have to have meaning and belonging. And they are not the same. But when you get them both, it's as if they are the same. You experience them together and the same, right? And that's where you get the kind of depth. And to me, basically, the main thing I want to say is for most of history, if you wanted to do the horizontal and you wanted to be in the meaningful, you had to leave home and go live near the city or go be part of a university. There were logistical and coordination limits that made it extremely difficult to return and stay in the testing of your creative ideas. Because you know how I've been saying you needed constant testing, right? Or you're going to slip too far to one side of the dialectic or the other, right? Well, if you don't live near a university, for example, how are you going to keep that testing going, right? So you return, but it's very difficult to actually maintain because the kind of return has to be constant, right? Like you have to get off the internet and then go back to common life and go back and forth. The return is not just a one-time thing. It's a constant work, a constant redoing, right? You have to go back into the deep philosophical conversation and then go back to the just everyday blacksmith, as Hume would say, right? You need the consistency, the regularity, right? For most of history, that was not available. You basically were put in a situation where it was one or the other, right? Because we had ineffective social coordination mechanisms. We did not have the infrastructure by which to address this issue well. Now we do. Now, anywhere on planet Earth, you can more readily plug into the conversation that will help you actually keep gaining horizontally to test if you're actually returning, if your ideas are actually full, and to keep it going, right? So this logistical reality actually helps us engage in creative verticality without sacrificing the verticality to our own notions and, you know, betraying the orthodoxy for heresy or something like that, and actually keep it alive. But that was also not possible so readily, and there's much more to be said on this, and I fear I will have to jump, until we have this infrastructure. And this infrastructure has emerged precisely at the moment of history where it is most needed. You could argue it was not so much needed until this moment of history because the world was not globalized, interconnected, and so on and so forth and complex. Now it is. Now the constant testing is needed, and people just simply need to believe in it and do it and submit themselves to it. So returning to verticality is how you get a creative verticality. And basically, I think this infrastructure allows a constant participation in that work, so that you no longer are put into a position due to logistical restraints of feeling like you have to choose between returning to common life and being part of the great conversation that you need to be part of to keep testing your ideas, to keep you in the mean of the dialectic. But Mr. Satori, if any final words, and thank you again for being here, sir.
Yeah. So the last thing I just want to say is, of course, this is the message that's in that parable of the prodigal son. And an
Yes.
interesting note, like that term prodigal is that it means that he was generous, or essentially he wanted to give. It wasn't that he wasted. That's how his brother saw it. His
Yes.
brother, who was all vertical, saw his
Yes.
going out and waste as waste, but there was no avenue for him to do what he was more made to do in that place. But he had to go back, and then his return is celebrated because he's, he did what he had to do. Essentially, he figured things out. So yeah, he completes the journey that his brother has yet to go on.
I think that is beautifully put. There, Jesus returns, ascension. There is all of this return. Return is absolutely critical. And the key is that to return is creative. When you return to the old or return to what you did before, it turns out that all things are new. And I think much of life is actually the realization that it's not so much that there are always new things, but which of course you can do, but that's a counterfeit. That's a simulacra. The fullness of life is found when all things are new. The things that are around you and have always been around you, nevertheless, unveil themselves to be new and ever deepening, according to that verticality that the horizontal brought out. Mr. Satori, please.
Okay, one last one. So I'll say this: with returning things new, you go to the other culture, you discover like the wonderful hot sauce that you never had before.
Yep.
And then you return and put it on everything you used to love and were bored of. So yeah, that's the way.
That is beautiful. The key is doing new things or ultimately to serve making things new. And you need to do both. So go somewhere and get a new hot sauce and put it on your favorite dish and make all things new.